Today, I think it's inexcusable to just rely on one person. And one thing that I have suggested, and it's not just me, there are other people who say this too, there should be some way in which Congress, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense are in on a decision, are required to be part of the decision-making process if this country ever has to seriously contemplate using a nuclear weapon.
That's the voice of Carol Giacomo, professor, award-winning journalist, and member of the New York Times Editorial Board. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button for our 68th episode. And this week, we change it up yet again. I'm back on early warning while Tom will be our interview host. And we're bringing back our Q&A segment.
Hey, Michelle, great to be here with you. What have you lined up for us on early warning?
We talk about the recently released Democratic Party platform and how we should be thinking about defense spending. And I'm joined by two rising stars, first-time guest Lisa Perry from the William J. Perry Project, and frequent guest Akshai Vikram on what was his last day as the Plowshares Fund Hale Fellow. We really miss him already.
After that, I sit down with nuclear policy expert and former New York Times Editorial Board member Carol Giacomo, who gives us a peek into the mysterious world of how editorial boards work and lays out her nuclear policy agenda for the next president.
And lastly, we are bringing back our Q&A segment with a question about what war with North Korea might look like, answered by our very own John Carl Baker. If you have a nuclear-related question, tweet us at @PressButtonPod or email us at pressthebutton@plowshares.org and get it answered on the air.
As always, please click the subscribe button and give us a rating. If you enjoy the show, please tell just one person about it this week. Word of mouth is a powerful way to spread the word, and we appreciate your help.
With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund. And we are also joined by first-time guest Lisa Perry, Communications Director for the William J. Perry Project and the host of the new podcast, At the Brink. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news starting now. Akshai, this past week, the Democratic Party released their draft platform, which covers a range of issues and will be finalized after the convention in August. Politico described it as a, quote, somewhat less hawkish foreign policy than 4 years ago. What does it say regarding nuclear issues, and what do you think it means for the election?
There's actually a lot about nuclear weapons issues in this document. So starting with what was preserved from 2016. So two of the Obama administration's biggest accomplishments, the New START agreement and the Iran nuclear deal, are in this document. And unsurprisingly, the Democrats are in favor of keeping them under a Biden administration. What's more interesting are the things that have changed since 2016. There's a bigger emphasis on alliances, and specifically this relates to North Korea. There's a lot more attention paid to working with South Korea to counter North Korea and its nuclear program. There's also a big change from Obama's nuclear posture review. For the first time, the Democrats are talking about a sole purpose for U.S. nuclear weapons, that we would only use nuclear weapons to deter and respond to a nuclear attack. And that's a big step forward for the No First Use campaign and a noted departure from previous platform language. And then finally, there was an increased attention towards defense spending and how much of an opportunity cost it is to keep funneling money into the Pentagon and towards nuclear modernization. And so I think taken together, this does move the Democratic Party in a more progressive position on nuclear weapons.
2 follow-up questions to this. First of all, what is the difference between sole purpose and no first use?
So sole purpose says that the only reason we would use nuclear weapons would be to respond or deter to a nuclear attack. And some would argue that it creates a window where if a nuclear weapon attack was incoming towards the United States, we could launch on warning, that before we were hit, we could launch because we knew we were about to be hit. Some people worried that this creates a hole that could lead to an accident. And that's why you need no first use, that you would not use nuclear weapons until you are sure that someone else has used them first. They're very closely related, and some would argue that the difference is more about semantics than policy, but it is worrisome that sole purpose is not quite as much of an insurance policy as no first use.
Okay, got it. So, and then my second question is, when it comes to this platform, obviously this is a Democratic Party platform. It is not quite the same as, what Biden may think, although I'm assuming they got it pretty close. How do you see this platform really reflecting Biden's views?
So that's a great question, because platforms are frequently derided as just pieces of paper that politicians don't pay attention to once they're in office. But I think on nuclear weapons issues, this is very different. Biden was the person in the Obama White House who got the votes for the New START treaty. He's been negotiating with Moscow on arms control since the 1970s, and he was a leading voice in the White House pushing for a sole purpose doctrine towards the end of the administration. So I think that this document is actually pretty well in line with Joe Biden's views and his track record on this issue, and he would live up to these commitments if elected.
Thanks, Akshai. So, Lisa, we were just talking about what the future for nuclear policy may look like, but I want to step back to the present. So, your podcast, At the Brink, encourages people to think differently about nuclear weapons and not just about the proverbial mushroom cloud. And the newest episode is actually highly relevant to what we saw play out over the past couple of weeks with these votes in Congress. The newest episode is looking at the monetary cost of nuclear weapons and shows how prioritizing spending on these weapons over other more pressing needs hurts our defense posture. How should we be thinking about the current defense budget in these times?
Well, our new episode looks at how prioritizing rebuilding our current Cold War-style nuclear arsenal, rather than really looking at what actual modern defense needs are, hurts us in the long run. And I think that point is more relevant now today than ever, especially in the past couple weeks. Congress just failed to pass a 10% defense budget cut, which was intended to instead be funneled towards funding food, housing, and education initiatives in a time when people are struggling domestically now more than ever. And this is despite the fact that, say, the Democrats having this policy platform and recent polling showing that people support a 10% defense budget by a 2-to-1 margin. And this really comes at a pretty painful juxtaposition when failing to pass this defense budget cut is happening at the same week that millions of Americans are losing their additional $600 federal unemployment payments. So I think this really brings this question of what really national security should be about. Right now, Congress is considering funding the DoD with an additional $21 billion in the next COVID stimulus package, on top of the $10.5 billion it was already afforded in the original CARES Act, of which right now only 23% has been used. I think that shoring up our economy to prevent an economic depression in the middle of a pandemic should absolutely be considered a national security priority. Officials in the Defense Department have threatened that without this additional influx of money, they might have to plunder things like the modernization budget. And to that, I quote the ever-brilliant Joe Cirincione from our new episode when he said, "We have to make them choose. If we don't make them prioritize, they will take whatever money they can get. And we need to think about what really makes us safer and stronger as a nation, and not just deflect into the standard patterns of assuming more weapons equals better."
Thanks for that. Your podcast is brilliant, by the way. I really love it, and I encourage people to go listen. I'm curious, your goal is to reach out to people who are not as familiar with nuclear issues. What are you finding that they care about, or how are they approaching or understanding these issues?
What I'm really seeing is a lot of people coming to me who have now listened to this, who aren't already in the nuclear space, who aren't aware of these things. And first of all, they're generally upset, feeling like all of this is sort of happening without their knowledge. They feel as if it's being hidden from them, and particularly when it comes to the money. And I think in newer generations, for millennials and Gen Z, are really aware of how our budget priorities really change what sort of influence we can have and the changes we can have in our nation. And right now you have movements like defund the police and working towards all kinds of different things to change our expectations of what we want to funnel our energy towards. And I think it really speaks to that energy, that people are interested in reconsidering what for so long we have just accepted as the standard of what we have to be doing, and say, well, questioning why is this the standard? Why does this make us safer? Does it make us safer? And can we maybe do this better?
In our remaining seconds, where can listeners go to listen to the podcast?
You can listen to At the Brink at atthebrink.org or anywhere you get your podcasts.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining.
Today on Press the Button, we have a very special guest. Carol Giacomo recently retired from the New York Times, where she was a member of the editorial board from 2007 to 2020. She wrote the newspaper's positions on all major foreign and defense issues, including nuclear weapons, Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And before that, she covered foreign and defense policy for Reuters for more than 2 decades. Carol, it is so great to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking me, Tom.
It is our pleasure. We are going to talk about your long experience as a reporter, editorial writer, and nuclear policy expert. It's a great combination. And let's start with your time at the Times. You just retired after 12 years at the New York Times Editorial Board. I know for most people, the editorial board is a bit of a black box. We see what comes out, but we can't see inside, and we don't really know who writes the opinions. So give us a sense of what it was like, what you did there, and how the process really works.
Sure. Let me just say that you're right. It's obscure process for many readers and even for many people at the Times. The whole point of the opinion section, of which the board is a part, has been that we focus on opinion and we are separate from the news side. And that has always been an important firewall between the two sides. The reporters go and do the stories, and they are not at all responsible for the opinions that are reflected anywhere on the opinion pages. And it's really protection for reporters that we should make that clear, so that people do not misinterpret the views of the editorial board on tax policy, for instance, and ascribe those views to reporters who are out there doing their best to just get the story and reflect it in an independent and authoritative way. So how did it work? I have to say that there was the, first part of my time on the editorial board when there was a rather traditional process in place. And in recent years, there has been a lot of change. I mean, the paper's been through a lot of change, and that is true for the opinion section. So in general, we have a board. At one point, it was as many as 18 people. At the moment, I'm not exactly sure where the number is, maybe 12, maybe 14. And most of those people are writers, and some of them are editors. And I was a writer, and we each have an area of expertise. So we have somebody who does economic policy, someone who does social justice issues, someone who covers politics, et cetera. And I did foreign policy. And we used to meet 3 days a week, and we'd go around the board, and everybody would talk about what was going on in their area and make suggestions as to what we should write editorials about. The editorials being they used to reflect the institutional view of the paper. And so, and we used to do, say, three a day, sometimes one very long one in a day. But for the most part, there were 3 editorials on different subjects: foreign policy, national policy, economic policy. There was usually a mix to try to give readers an idea of what was going on.
So more about you. How did you move from reporting to editorializing?
Well, I was a reporter for most of my career, and I've only spent the last 12 years as an editorial writer. So for most of my career, I really kept my personal opinion in check. That's just the way you do it as a reporter. I think that's right. An obligation you have to keep your own opinion under wraps. I spent a lot of time in Washington. I went there in 1981. I was working for the Hartford Courant at the time, and then in 83, I was hired by Reuters to cover foreign and defense policy in Congress. So I spent many decades, first with Reuters in Congress, then covering the State Department, covering all the big foreign policy and defense stories that were U.S.-centered. You know, during those years, the United States was very much a leader on the foreign policy front. So I covered all those stories, and I learned a lot from everybody I could learn from. And in 2007, there was an opening on the New York Times Editorial Board, and somebody I used to compete against in Washington called me up and said, "How would you like a job?" And, you know, I loved what I was doing for Reuters at the time, but this really was a new challenge. It seemed like a great opportunity, and so I seized it.
And was it liberating to go from telling the straight story to having your own opinions about it?
It was terrifying, actually. I mean, that's a big leap. I mean, you spend a lot of time sort of wrapping your opinions into a ball and sort of keeping them in your pocket. And all of a sudden, now you're supposed to sort of burst forth with not just opinions, but prescriptions, if they're available, to the problems that we might discuss. And I have to say that there was much trepidation, and I wasn't sure I could do it. But the first piece I was asked to write was about the India nuclear deal. And as it happened, I had spent a lot of time covering the nuclear deal, and I had very strong opinions about it. I was very critical of it. And so when I was asked to sit down and write a piece about that, it came pretty easily. And so that was good for me, because when you write about something you really know, it's a lot easier than when you try to tackle a subject that is something that you aren't covering quite as intensely.
You have now traveled that journey and are spending more of your time writing policy proposals and opinions, which I'm very happy to see. For example, you just wrote a great article that I highly recommend for Arms Control Today in the July-August issue called "Getting Back on Track to Zero Nuclear Weapons." You write in there that, quote, "There is little sense of urgency, in part because the task is so daunting, the challenge is so complex, the goal seemingly distant," unquote. If you could expand on this and tell us how you think we can change this, and does media play a role in this question of urgency?
You have to start first with electing a different president. I mean, that's just the reality. I wish I could say that, you know, both candidates have, you know, nuclear agenda that are worthy of discussion, and maybe both have good qualities to it. But the truth is, you know, President Trump has been very hostile to arms control, and there is no reason to believe that he's going to change. He blew up the Iran nuclear deal, the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces treaties. He's pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty. So far, he's left the New START Treaty, which has forced the United States and Russia to reduce their nuclear arsenals and subject themselves to intensive verification. He's left that treaty hanging by a thread. Biden, by contrast, has a history of caring, understanding, and working on behalf of sane nuclear policies. Now, so far, you certainly haven't heard Biden talk much about this at all. And that's because I think the overwhelming issues in this campaign have been and are figuring out what to do with the COVID crisis, rescuing the economy, dealing with the grave legacy of racial injustice. So those are what certainly has seized the American public as critical issues. So I do worry a little bit that if Biden were to be elected, that, he would be overwhelmed by other imperatives, and therefore he might not have much time for the nuclear brief. So, can we affect this in any way? Well, there are things we can do, and they're pretty basic. Lawmakers and activist groups can make clear that addressing the nuclear portfolio is a priority. They can educate the public about what the threat is and how it can be addressed. Voters can call and write their Congress members to intensify their focus on the nuclear issues. And of course, the media can play a role by asking questions at the presidential debate, asking questions on the campaign trail. Reporters can do stories about the relevant nuclear issues and where they stand and what we're about to lose. And of course, opinion pages can weigh in a very strong way if the editorial writers, if the newspapers care about it. One hopes that they will.
You wrote that Trump's expansive interpretation of presidential power, willingness to act unilaterally, impulsive nature, and disregard for expertise have raised profound concerns about how he would handle a nuclear crisis. How does that view affect your feelings about presidential sole authority?
Well, as I said, I've been covering nuclear issues for a very long time. And for a long time, the focus really wasn't on presidential sole authority. When I began covering the nuclear file in 1983, I think most people assumed that the United States president would exercise nuclear weapons with a basic level of care and deliberation. That isn't to say people didn't question the president's judgments or policies, depending on who the president was. But America is the only country that has ever launched a nuclear attack, which of course was against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Among most Americans, I think, there was a great sensitivity to the grave nature of what that meant and all the lives that were lost. And the aim was never to use them again. So for a long time, I saw the focus as first deterring the adversary, the Soviet Union and then Russia, and then, competing against the adversary or if need, overpowering the adversary in a conflict. In the past 20 years, the national agenda has expanded to include reducing rather than building up nuclear weapons arsenals, securing nuclear stockpiles and facilities, keeping Iran and North Korea from developing their weapons programs, things like that. But since Trump came to office, the question of sole presidential authority has assumed, I would say, a much greater importance and a much greater urgency. For the reasons that I outlined in that article, he doesn't read or study. He shows no understanding of what nuclear weapons are, how they figure in the national security agenda. He's sometimes even threatened to use nuclear weapons. You don't use that threat as a rhetorical device. It's just inappropriate and irresponsible. He doesn't value science or the advice of experts who could help him arrive at good decisions. And we all know that if a president were ever confronted with the horrible choice of using a nuclear weapon, the time to make that decision would be very short. Today, I think it's inexcusable to just rely on one person. And one thing that I have suggested, and it's not just me, there are other people who say this too, there should be some way in which Congress, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense are in on a decision, are required to be part of the decision-making process if this country ever has to seriously contemplate using a nuclear weapon.
In your article, you talk about the current context where you talk about the coronavirus pandemic, the collapse of the economy, the turmoil facing our system as a result of systemic racism. Yeah, and you observe quite correctly that the next president's plate will be full. What would you like to see, given that context, from the next president on nuclear policy?
Well, I think the first thing, as I also indicated, Trump has dismantled a lot of the nuclear guardrails that were shoring up this system that we've put in place over decades to try to encourage smart decisions, careful decisions, and just check the ability to expand and use nuclear weapons. So whoever is the new president should make clear very early on that the United States is ready to work with Russia again to lead international arms control efforts. Right now, the United States isn't leading on anything except maybe coronavirus counts. And there are certain things that the president could do quickly on his own. Tell Russia that the United States is prepared to extend the New START treaty for another 5 years. Tell Iran that if Tehran goes back into compliance, the United States will immediately rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal that Trump has disavowed. Recommit to the nuclear testing moratorium that the United States is now raising questions about possibly tossing over. Recommit to trying to get the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into force. Return to the Open Skies Treaty. I would start with that.
Carol, thank you very much. I certainly am one who's very happy that you have switched from reporting, which I'm no doubt you were fabulous at, to editorializing and into opinions, because I think you're doing a fabulous job with it, and I really appreciate your time being here. And I wish you all the best in your post-New York Times retirement period, and I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
Welcome back to our question and answer segment. We are shaking things up. Instead of one person in Plowshares Fund answering all the questions, multiple staff will be stepping into our virtual recording studio over the coming months to have a go at it. Today's question comes from Nick in Virginia, and here to answer it is John Carl Baker, Senior Program Officer here at Plowshares Fund, who covers much of our North Korea work. John Carl, are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Go ahead.
So Nick wants to know, can you lay out some scenarios for what a war with North Korea would look like? How devastating would it be? Would nuclear weapons inevitably be involved?
This is a great question. And I think my first answer to it is that the scenario of an outright North Korean invasion across the DMZ is pretty unlikely. Occasionally you hear a warning about this from analysts. But South Korea has a highly organized military. It's super advanced. They have all sorts of high-tech weaponry and a big alliance with the U.S. So that's not very likely. What seems more likely is that there's some kind of a miscalculation or an accident that spirals into a military conflict. There's many ways in which this could happen, but Jeffrey Lewis has sketched the scenario of a South Korean airliner shot down on accident by the North Korean military. And then there's calls for retaliation because there's hundreds of South Koreans dead. So the Republic of Korea retaliates in a measured fashion, but then the conflict is escalated because of Trump's intervention on social media. And the way he phrases his threat to Kim Jong-un on social media makes Kim Jong-un think that an invasion is imminent and that there's going to be regime change. So Kim Jong-un launches nuclear weapons. Now, I don't have any idea how likely this precise scenario is, but the basic outline of a containable crisis that spirals into an outright war seems pretty plausible to me. The question of would it inevitably be a nuclear war? No, I don't think so. I don't think anything's inevitable. It's possible that the war would remain a conventional one, but we're talking about a highly militarized border, two sides that are still technically at war. So once you begin a conventional conflict, the risk of it escalating into the nuclear zone becomes much more plausible and likely. So we definitely don't want a conventional conflict to break out at all. And I would say too that even if the conflict remains conventional, we're still talking about tens of thousands of casualties in just a matter of days. Now, obviously, in a nuclear scenario, that would be even worse. We're talking about totals that could be as high as 2 million. That was Jeffrey Lewis's estimate. And I saw one earlier on 38 North that said it could be as high as 3.8 million. So either way, we're talking about a horrific war that we should do whatever we can to prevent from starting.
Another week, another question. Thanks, John Carl.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.